Nearly 9 million Americans checked a box on a government form that said Cherokee. 9 million. That's more people than the entire population of New York City. But here's the number that should stop you cold. Historians estimate the actual Cherokee population, at its peak before removal, never exceeded 50,000 people. So where did the other 8.9 million come from? And why does almost every family in America seem to have the exact same story? A great-great-grandmother, always a Cherokee princess, who somehow left no name, no rolls, no record, just a rumor, passed down like a family heirloom. Today, DNA is finally answering the question nobody wanted asked out loud. What if the ancestor never existed at all? And what if the real story, the one written in the genome, is far stranger and far more important than the myth? Maybe you've heard it in your own family. Thanksgiving table, someone leans in and says, "You know, we've got Cherokee blood. Your great-great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee princess who married a settler." It's one of the most repeated stories in American genealogy. Historians even have a name for it: the Cherokee grandmother myth. It shows up in white families across every state, from Georgia to Oklahoma, to states the Cherokee never even lived in. And it always follows the same script: a beautiful indigenous ancestor, a forbidden romance, a family secret kept out of shame or pride. For over a century, people believed it because it was unfalsifiable. There was no way to check. Then home DNA testing arrived. 20 million people mailed in a tube of spit, expecting a confirmation. What they got instead was a reckoning. Picture a woman in her 50s. We'll call her the composite of thousands of real cases genealogists have documented. She grew up hearing about her Cherokee great-great-grandmother. She spits into a tube, mails it off, waits the 6 weeks. The result comes back. Less than 1% indigenous American, statistically meaningless, the kind of trace signal that shows up in millions of people of any background due to how these algorithms work. She's not alone. Genetic genealogists who've studied thousands of these Cherokee princess claims have found the same pattern again and again. The vast majority turn up no detectable indigenous ancestry at all. So, was the whole family lying? Not exactly. And this is where the story gets more interesting than a simple myth-busting video. Because even when someone's family story turns out to be false as literal genealogy, historians have found something else hiding underneath it, a pattern that tells us something real about America's past. The Cherokee princess myth wasn't random. It exploded specifically in the decades after the Trail of Tears, when having native ancestry went from being dangerous to admit to suddenly, for white Southerners trying to explain a distant relative's darker complexion or trying to claim land allotments being useful to invent. But if millions of these stories are fabricated or exaggerated, that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens to the people whose Cherokee ancestry is real, documented, provable, historically undeniable, but whose DNA results don't match what a consumer test expects to see? Because that's the twist almost nobody talks about. DNA testing companies cannot actually identify Cherokee ancestry specifically. Not even close. And the reason why takes us into the deepest, strangest part of this story, a fight that's still happening right now between science and sovereignty, blood and belonging. Here's what most people don't understand about ancestry DNA tests. When a company tells you that you're 12% indigenous American, it's not comparing your DNA to the Cherokee Nation. It's comparing you to a small, broad reference panel of indigenous peoples across the entire Western Hemisphere, sometimes just a few hundred samples representing hundreds of distinct nations, from the Arctic to the tip of South America. There is no genetic marker that says Cherokee the way there's a marker for, say, a specific inherited disease. Why? Because tribal nations in the United States, including the Cherokee Nation, the largest tribal nation in the country, have deliberately, and for very good reason, resisted broad genetic research on their citizens. For decades, indigenous communities were exploited by researchers who took blood samples for one stated purpose and used them for entirely different studies without consent, undermining trust for generations. So the reference data commercial companies rely on is thin, imprecise, and in the Cherokee Nation's own words, incapable of determining tribal citizenship. The Cherokee Nation has said this publicly and repeatedly. A DNA test cannot make you Cherokee, and it was never designed to. So if a spit test can't tell you, what can? This is where the story stops being about biology and becomes something far more human and far more contested. Because the real answer isn't written in your genome at all, it's written in a set of paper rolls from over a century ago. And that paper trail is about to lead us somewhere nobody expects. In the 1890s, the United States government forced tribal nations, including the Cherokee, to compile something called the Dawes Rolls, a census used to break up communally held tribal land into individual private plots, a policy designed, in the government's own language at the time, to dissolve tribal nations entirely. Every enrolled Cherokee family was recorded, along with a federally assigned blood quantum, a fraction meant to measure how Cherokee a person supposedly was. Today, the Cherokee Nation is one of the few major tribes that does not use blood quantum for citizenship. Instead, citizenship is granted to any documented direct descendant of someone listed on that original roll, regardless of what percentage of ancestry that represents. Which means a Cherokee Nation citizen could be 1/32nd Cherokee by ancestry and still be fully, legally, culturally Cherokee, while someone with a much higher indigenous American percentage on a DNA test, but no documented lineage to the rolls, has no claim to citizenship at all. Genetics and citizenship, it turns out, are almost completely separate systems, and that separation is about to collide with one of the most painful chapters in Cherokee history. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone. There is a group of people with an unbroken, documented, government-verified connection to the Cherokee Nation going back over 150 years who are still fighting, as recently as 2017, just to have that connection legally recognized. Their story has almost nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with what belonging really means. Before the Civil War, some Cherokee citizens, like some of their white American neighbors, enslaved people of African descent. After the war, the United States forced the Cherokee Nation to sign the Treaty of 1866, which formally freed those enslaved individuals known as the Cherokee Freedmen and guaranteed them full Cherokee citizenship, with all the rights of native Cherokees. For decades, freedmen families lived, voted, and were buried as citizens of the Cherokee Nation. Many appear on the very same Dawes Rolls as other Cherokee citizens, just listed on a separate freedmen schedule rather than a blood schedule. Then in 1983, the Cherokee Nation changed its constitution to require descent from the blood rolls, specifically effectively stripping freedmen descendants of citizenship, despite their documented, treaty-guaranteed history in the nation. For over 3 decades, freedmen descendants fought in tribal and federal courts to have their citizenship restored. In 2017, a U.S. federal court ruled decisively in their favor, citing the 1866 treaty. The Cherokee Nation's own Supreme Court upheld it. Freedmen descendants are Cherokee citizens today not because of a single strand of DNA, but because of a 19th century treaty and an unbroken paper record. It's the clearest proof yet that this entire story was never really about genetics. It was about power, who gets to decide who belongs, and why that decision has been fought over for 150 years. Which brings us back to where we started the 9 million Americans who checked Cherokee on a census form. Because here's the strangest twist of all. Real Cherokee history itself is stranger, older, and more surprising than any invented princess legend could ever be. Linguists have long noted something odd. The Cherokee language belongs to the Iroquoian family closely related to languages spoken by over 500 miles away, around the Great Lakes in modern-day New York. Every other neighboring nation in the Cherokee homeland of the Southeast spoke completely unrelated languages. Which means, at some point in the deep past, long before European contact, ancestors of the Cherokee likely migrated a vast distance south, a real documented mystery of ancient movement that has nothing to do with a fictional princess and everything to do with a genuinely ancient, genuinely remarkable history. So, what does the DNA actually tell us in the end? It tells us that millions of American families built an identity on a story that likely never happened. It tells us that real Cherokee history, a nation with its own ancient migration, its own written syllabary invented from scratch by Sequoia, its own constitution, its own devastating forced removal, and its own modern legal battles over who belongs is far richer than the myth that replaced it in the popular imagination. And it tells us something uncomfortable about why that myth spread in the first place. It let people claim a connection to indigenous history without confronting the actual cost of what happened to indigenous nations. The Cherokee Nation today has over 400,000 citizens. It runs its own government, courts, schools, and hospitals. It is not a memory. It is not a fraction on a spit test. It is a living nation that has spent 2 centuries fighting simply to define itself on its own terms. So the next time someone at your table says, "We've got Cherokee blood," you'll know the real question isn't how much DNA you share with an ancient population. It's whether you know the actual history behind that claim, the removal, the rolls, the freedmen, the fight that's still going on today. And if a single nation's identity can be this contested, this complicated, this misunderstood by millions of people who think they already know the answer, what does that mean for every other family legend hiding in your own bloodline? Because we're about to test another one, and this next ancestry claim, when the DNA came back, turned out to hide something even the family had no idea about. That's next, here on Imperial Archives.